Hey everyone, and welcome to a slightly different type of video on this channel. Game of Thrones is one of my favourite TV shows ever and one of the biggest shows of all time. I started watching the show between seasons 5 and 6 and watched the rest week by week up until the show ended. This show really pushed the boundaries of what could be accomplished in television and shattered many people's expectations of how badly you could end a TV series. One of the few positives that came from Season 8 though was my interest in the books, which I started reading during the pandemic and finished pretty recently actually. Well, finished the first 5 books, come on George, I know you can do it. But this inspired me to take a look back on one of the most beloved shows ever with some fresh new perspectives. Number 1, the knowledge of how the story is told in the books, what changes were made for the better, for the worse, and it gives me a nice point of comparison. Number 2, the knowledge of how the whole story ended. Were there warning signs this early on of the direction the show would end up taking? And, you know, the perspective of somebody trying to critically review a TV series they haven't seen in about 8 years. This was a very long process that quickly ballooned in video size. I'm sure George R. R. Martin can relate. But I'm happy with the evaluations I made. I'm going to go through each episode individually and review them in depth in comparison to their book counterparts and with the context of how the larger story evolves. Obviously there will be pretty big spoilers, however I've tried to keep it relatively spoiler free beyond season 1. There will also be timecodes in the description for each episode and for my general conclusions at the very end of the video, because I know this is going to be a long journey. So strap in, because
winter is coming.
So we start off with episode 1, Winter is Coming, and this had the unenviable job of introducing a load of characters, starting a load of plot lines, and doing a huge amount of world building, and I think it manages it pretty well. This episode has a pretty good pace, and it has a really good balance of both storytelling and just setting the foundations for this world. In particular, the first sequence I think does a really good job introducing us to everything we need to know about this. It gives us some glorious scope of the wall and beyond it, and we see some great production design and some glorious effects on those whites that we see. I'm going to be honest, I'm not really a fan of seeing the whites running like that, and I think the editing choices they make are weird and kind of just for the sake of it being more horror movie-esque than I would like, but it did make for a very chilling opening and a dark start to the show that sets the tone immediately. Of course, I also want to briefly talk about the title sequence. I think that Ramin Djawadi does an incredible job with his score. They don't use the score very often in this episode, but whenever it's on, it steals the show for me. And of course the title sequence is his best work. It was so good that House of the Dragon had to use it. But as well as that, visuals wise, I think it does a really good job establishing the geography. It shows multiple of the relevant locations throughout the episode, like the Wall, Winterfell, King's Landing, Pentos, and it's able to do a lot of the world building basically for free. The music I think is superb, and it's just such a great title sequence. Anyway, I've wasted enough time talking about that. Let's get to the main actual story, and we start off in Winterfell in a courtyard there, and this is first of many scenes that isn't in the books, and really just serves there to deepen the characters, explain a lot of the world and what's going on over here. And because of this, exposition can be really clunky at times. Sometimes it feels like the characters are talking to the audience more than they're talking to other characters. And there are points even where it seems they ADR'd in some exposition, which felt very distracting. But this episode did have the really difficult job of trying to introduce so many characters at once and explain who all of them are. The good thing is, once it does all of those introductions, it really hits a stride, giving us some really great character moments. Robert meeting the Starks, Ned and Robert in the crypts, the whole feast sequence, Jon meeting Tyrion, Cersei and Catelyn talking to Sansa. The performances all around are really solid, and the directing is great too, with particularly good blocking in some of the scenes. And whilst the colour grading isn't quite right, it very much looks like an early 2010s TV show. From a production value perspective, it's superb. The sets, the costumes, the sound, and of course we have some fantastic performances, including from the young actors. And it all just comes together to make this feel like a really believable world. Even though this show has its budgetary limitations and they hadn't quite found their stride, it just all fits together and makes for a really good universe. And it uses a really tight pace to move the story along and find organic ways of building the world for the most part. There is one scene, and it isn't in the books, it's in King's Landing. It's where we meet Jaime and Cersei at Jon Arryn's funeral, and we don't really know who Jon Arryn or really who Cersei or Jaime are, and I don't see the point of this scene. The dialogue just doesn't sound right, and they kind of let the cat out of the bag about the Lannisters being involved in Jon Arryn's death. You see, in the books, all of this is revealed in Lysa's letter to Catelyn, which makes this a big sort of reveal and also builds a lot of mystery around the Lannisters. However, this scene in King's Landing in the show kind of spoils that sequence and really awkwardly breaks the structure of the episode. You know, you're telling me that we couldn't see Arya, Sansa and Rickon getting their pet direwolves, but we did have to get a random scene of two characters telling us stuff that we're going to find out later in the episode. It just doesn't sit right. I think that if you move the scene to Winterfell after the feast, it makes more sense there, and it would also nicely foreshadow their activities later on in the episode. Speaking of very uncomfortable things, we meet Daenerys, who isn't given much characterization yet. However, Viserys and the Dothraki are given a lot of characterization. I really like the Dothraki wedding sequence, and here the exposition is a lot more natural, as both Targaryens are outsiders to the Dothraki, same as the audience. And of course the scene that comes after the wedding is deeply uncomfortable, which I'm sure is intentional. The Targaryen scenes generally feel really awkward, too incestuous at points, but I think that is the point. And of course the episode ends with Bran witnessing the second most uncomfortable act of incest this episode, and him getting thrown out of a window. What a cliffhanger to end your pilot on. So what do I think about the episode as a whole? It has aged more than I thought, but from a film, or rather television making perspective, it's superb. The directing, the production value, it's all top notch. It does a really great job closely following the story from the books, and whilst there are a couple of differences, like that weird King's Landing scene and Will and Jared being swapped at the start, it does serve to deepen the characters and the world. And so it's exposition heavy at points, but it did have an awful lot to do, so I can't complain about it too much. This episode was engaging throughout with a fantastic beginning and end, so overall I would rate it a 7 out of 10. It's an important first steps into this show and into the introductions, but it hasn't quite got to the main course of the season yet. So episode 2, The King's Road, gets off to a lot stronger of a start and moves the story along more and builds upon its characters. We start off with Tyrion slapping Joffrey. In fact, the bookends of this episode are both Joffrey getting beaten up, and it's glorious. And our Lannister time is fun. We see Jaime talk with Jon, which is a nice reminder of who both of our characters are, and also the weight of Jon's decision to go to the Wall. As a whole, the highlight of this episode for me is Jon Snow leaving Winterfell, including all of his goodbyes. His goodbye with Arya is heartwarming, his goodbye with Bran is heartbreaking, and it's pretty cool seeing him say farewell to Robb as well. We also get the introduction of the Stark theme in this episode. Ramin Djawadi is such a good composer, and the Stark theme is just beautiful. We see Ned and Jon have one final discussion with each other. There's some obvious irony, which is Ned says when they next see each other they'll discuss Jon Snow's mother, even though they will unfortunately never see each other again. But what I did think about here is that what I think Ned is banking on is Jon taking the Oaths of the Night's Watch so that he can escape Robert's wrath, similar to what Aemon Targaryen did. Another one of the highlights of this episode is Michelle Fairley, who really shines here. She gives a great performance. In particular, the contrast between the way she acts with Jon and Ned are so different, and her performance is brilliant, in particular the way that she displays grief, in the way that she reacts to the assassin, and it's a very convincing performance. Another very convincing performance comes from Emilia Clarke, who's great in this episode. And it's this episode where we really start to get some characterization for Daenerys as they travel. There's a lot of traveling in this episode, but the mini arc of her trying to love Drogo and fit into Dothraki is really interesting, and it's a pretty satisfying climax at the end of the episode, pun intended. Once again, the direction and the production design are phenomenal, and also once again, my least favourite part of the episode is a scene that wasn't in the books. Cersei goes to speak to Catelyn and says that she had a miscarried child with dark hair. I'm going to assume that this is a very ham-fisted hint at a reveal that comes later, but it really serves very little purpose. For starters, it's a break of character for Cersei. She really hates Robert in the books and she would never bear his child, so my headcanon for it is that this is just a lie. But in that case, if you're lying, why would you say the child had dark hair? Wouldn't that kind of spoil a twist that comes later on in the season? Another performance I really enjoyed in this episode was Mark Addy as Robert Baratheon, as we see a really good range of stuff from this character. The scene of him and Ned reminiscing is really cool, him shouting at Cersei and Joffrey is also really cool, and his conflicted nature at the end is portrayed very well. The pace does slow a little bit in the episode midway through, just because they need to move the plot on. The scenes are still fine, but they're not as emotionally resounding or as entertaining as before. However, it really picks up as the last 10 minutes are excellent. Daenerys learns Cowgirl, Sansa meets the Hound, and we begin to see who Joffrey really is. Jack Gleeson is having so much fun in every scene, and he gets hit by a stick, which is a bonus. Arya saying goodbye to Nymeria was sad, and the performances from everyone, in particular the child actors, in the scenes afterwards were great all around. Where everyone's giving their sides of the story, it's actually pretty good foreshadowing for what's going to happen in King's Landing later on. A lot of characters are lying and scheming to get themselves a free pass, meanwhile the people lower down the chain, like Micah, are the ones to suffer. This has a particularly twisted and sad ending with some dire consequences. Pun also intended. But in this world, even the innocent direwolves can die. And this episode as a whole has a lot of the same positives as the previous episode. However, with this episode, it cuts straight to the point and moves smoothly with a selection of really great scenes. The acting all around is excellent, the dialogue is brilliant, and the start and end of the episode are filled with raw emotion. I really like this episode, and it's a great set of foreshadowing for what's to come. I'm giving this episode a 9 out of 10. Okay, episode 3, Lord Snow sees us finally arrive at King's Landing, and we don't see too much of the city thanks to what are most likely budgetary restraints, but the few sets that we do see are pretty nice and are very distinct from all the sets we've seen before set in the north. We meet Varys, Littlefinger, Renly and Pycelle, with Littlefinger being a particular highlight of the episode, and their small council scenes are pretty fun, and they also add an interesting level of complexity to running a kingdom that we don't usually see in fantasy. Sansa and Arya aren't getting along as per usual, and unfortunately they're not getting along with Ned either. So he repays Arya, where we meet Syrio Forel, and their lesson is a particular highlight of the episode for me. Syrio just steals the scene. The lesson that he gives to Arya is really fun, but the cherry on top of it all is Ned watching in the background and hearing steel clanging, as he gets what seems to be PTSD from his wartime experiences. Just a really nice little detail to add in there. In this episode there are quite a few scenes that are not in the book, but hey, they're all great. Jaime and Ned speaking in the throne room is brilliant, where the dialogue is so tight and layered. We have the scene where we meet Barristan Selmy, and he's talking to Robert and Jaime about each of their first kills, and we have more incest, yay! One weird difference from the books, though, is Varys being involved in the whole Littlefinger dagger thing. He says that he's already met Cat before, which is weird. But of all the characters in Westeros, the one who is most likely to know that Littlefinger is hiding Catelyn inside a brothel is probably Varys, so I'll pass that he's crashing this scene. One issue that I do kind of come across with this episode is that because the storylines have now fully split into several locations, it does result in us jumping between locations kind of randomly, but I think it actually does give a good indication of time moving, so it is what it is. We see Daenerys travelling with the Dothraki, learning their language, wearing their clothes. She's starting to respect Drogo and the Dothraki more, which makes for a pretty interesting arc so far. And also Viserys gets owned by Rakaro, which was deeply satisfying. There's a surprisingly good scene between Jorah and Rakaro talking about their weapons, and yeah, it's pretty enjoyable. We get a little teaser of Jorah being an informant to the crown, and we also find out that Daenerys is pregnant. Meanwhile, Castle Black was really cool as well. It's our first time going to Castle Black, excluding the prologue scene, and yeah, it's really cool. The sets feel great, they feel cold, and also they feel lived in. Top-notch production value there. We get to meet Alyssa Thorne, Jeor Mormont, Maester Aemon. The latter of the two end up talking to Tyrion and asking for some help. And I like the Tyrion scenes in this episode. He gives Jon some advice on how to settle in, which shows that Tyrion has a nice sympathy for outcasts like him. We get to see him take a piss off the wall, and his scene with Yoren and Benjen was fun. I genuinely don't understand how they come up with Tyrion's dialogue. It's just so witty. But for the most part, this is a world-building episode split between 4 locations, and I think they get a pretty good balance of all 4 locations and storylines. King's Landing was great, Castle Black was fun, Old Nan was weirder than I remember, and I'm super annoyed about the fact they got rid of Bran's dream from the books. But for the most part, it was a really solid episode with so many great scenes and excellent dialogue all around. 9 out of 10, very few flaws. Then we move on to episode 4, Cripples, Bastards and Broken Things, and we start off by getting a vision of the Three-Eyed Raven. This isn't as cool as the vision in the books, but it's still neat. Tyrion makes a saddle for Bran, which is adorable. He then owns Robb and mega owns Theon. I love Peter Dinklage in this role. And we also meet Hodor, so that's cool. We then go to Vaes Dothrak, where Viserys takes a bath in what turns out to be a pretty good scene showing a lot of range from Harry Lloyd. And there's a Faceless Men reference in this scene. Nice. And Daenerys starts to defend herself, and whilst the majority of the Doreah stuff isn't in the books, it's a welcome addition that I think adds to the Daenerys character arc in this season really well. At the Wall, we meet Sam, and John Bradley sells the role really well, and we get some really nice camaraderie between him and John, and also between the rest of the Night's Watch recruits. Breaking that apart, we have the monologue from Alyssa Thorne, which I thought was great, and as a whole, this Castle Black story this episode was a joy. At King's Landing, Ned begins to do some research, leading to a pretty weird scene with Cersei, but one scene I did really enjoy was his talk with Arya. Maisie Williams is just so genuine and convincing in this role. I think it truly is perfect casting. Ned also meets Gendry and tries to meet Sir Hugh of the... Wait, is that Jason Lannister from House of the Dragon? I had no idea that he plays 3 different roles in this universe. We also get more Sansa this episode, including her meeting Littlefinger, which made for a pretty fun scene with some sneaky exposition thrown in there. Then Tyland dies, Tyrion's arrested, and the episode ends. So what are my thoughts? I don't think this is as strong as the previous 2 episodes, simply because not a lot of plot happens. Once again, this is a collection of very good scenes, but at points it feels like it's padding for time. For example, the chat that Jory had with Jaime Lannister, it kind of just felt like filler. Don't get me wrong, it was fun filler, but it still didn't really progress the story much. Castle Black was a highlight, any scene involving Tyrion was great, and these performances are all stellar, but it's just weighed down by a story that didn't evolve much in the 60-minute runtime. 8 out of 10, I still liked it. Episode 5, The Lion and the Wolf, doesn't feature Jon or Daenerys, and opts to focus more on the main storyline, so because of that I don't have a huge amount to say about this episode. One thing that I did really like was Mark Addy's performance as Robert Baratheon, where he steals basically every scene he's in. From him asking for the breastplate stretcher, to him raging at trying to kill a child, he has a lot of really great scenes in this that show a wide range of emotions. The dialogue once more is great, the directing is superb, and there are several really exciting action sequences this episode. The jousting sequence featuring the mountain is suitably bloody, Clegane Bowl was really fun, and it's fun to see Tyrion bash someone's head in with a shield as well. Showing the Eyrie in the titles was a nice detail, and the additions of Lysa and Robin Arryn made for some pretty fun scenes, although I was slightly distracted by the CGI of the Sky Cells, which doesn't really hold up to today's standards. This episode is also a slight victim of what would later be known as sexposition, where the plot of the episode is broken up with sex scenes involving side characters like Theon and Ros, Renly and Loras, and the dialogue and directing of these scenes are good enough, but they serve little purpose other than to keep audiences excited and maybe give some little bits of character development. The scenes that I found far more exciting were scenes like Varys and Littlefinger having a scheme-off, Ned resigning as Hand of the King over the death of a child, and Arya overhearing Varys and Illyrio Mopatis scheming. By the way, this is the last time we see Illyrio in the show, just thought I'd mention that. Because these scenes are way more interesting. There's great dialogue, great acting, and there's the ability to explore genuinely intriguing moral dilemmas across the episode, where you really feel the weight of these decisions. And of course, there's a show-only scene between Robert and Cersei discussing their marriage, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, previously I've complained about scenes that aren't in the books that I don't really like, but this is an exception, because it fits exactly in with who the characters are in both the books and the show, but it just adds a little bit more depth to their relationship. And the episode, of course, goes to a climax in an excellent action scene between Jaime and Ned, and it's well shot, it's exciting, it's violent, and most importantly, there are very real consequences to this fight scene. This episode had a thrilling start and end with really intriguing plot lines and some great scenes in the middle. 9 out of 10. Episode 6, A Golden Crown, was an absolute thrill ride from start to finish. We start off with Robert, Ned, and Cersei arguing in a great scene before whisked off to Essos, where Daenerys is fire or heat-proof. Targaryens being fireproof isn't in the books, which makes Daenerys' final line of the episode kind of funny. She eats a horse's heart, which is a pretty good scene as well, and I think that Emilia Clarke and Jason Momoa really sell their relationship well here. We get to see Bran riding on a horse, which is sweet, wildlings attack immediately afterwards, which is less sweet, and Ros leaves Winterfell, which also isn't in the books, but I don't really mind as it adds a new perspective to the story. But the main highlight of this episode is what's going on in the Vale. Throughout the storyline, we can see Tyrion really strategizing and calculating his chances as he tries to talk his way out of captivity, and these scenes are surprisingly funny, with Peter Dinklage's performance, as always, being excellent. The fight scene between Bronn and Savardis was great, and we can see that Bronn is using his wits to win the fight, which mirrors Tyrion using his wits in the rest of the episode. The whole Eerie subplot is brilliant this episode, with a fast pace, good characters, witty dialogue, and some very creative plot writing, capped off with a great fight scene. But wait, there's more, because we get to see Sansa mega own Septa Mordain, receive a gift, and Joffrey kisses her. That's Sansa, not Septa Mordain. We also have Ned sentencing the Mounted to death, which makes sense given how Ned clearly doesn't like child murder and how the Mountain killed Rhaegar's children in Robert's rebellion. In a way, it feels like this is Ned's justice for those actions as much as it's justice for his actions in the Riverlands in the present. Side note, Aidan Gillen does a really good job portraying Littlefinger, who we can see is subtly manipulating Ned in many scenes, and it's pulled off very well. Then we get to see more Syrio, Ned makes a big discovery, and you'd expect this reveal to be the end of the episode, but no, it still keeps going, as Viserys steals the show in his final episode with a great performance from Harry Lloyd in both his scene with Jorah and his final scene where he finally gets his golden crown. It's suitably brutal, cathartic, and ironic, and one of the most creative deaths in the whole show. This episode has so much that I like about it. The Vale, Vice Dothrak, King's Landing, they all have really good plot lines this episode, with each finding some really good twists in there. Visually, the episode is fantastic, the acting is excellent, and the pacing's great. But above all else, this writing is superb. This is peak Game of Thrones, 10 out of 10. Moving on to episode 7, You Win or You Die. And it's really sad watching these scenes in the build-up, knowing how the various decisions that these characters make are going to lead to their demises in the end. But in the case of Ned, it makes more sense, as many of the decisions he makes are regarding his morals and his ideas of what's right. The problem is, he's a moral character wandering around in a very immoral world. Ned and Cersei's scene at the very start of the episode is great, and is a very good example of this. I also really enjoyed Robert Baratheon's final moments, which are surprisingly emotional, and it's really nice to see some reflection and almost redemption here for this character. And it's intriguing to see how all of these characters in King's Landing are basically circling like sharks around to try and grab power from the shadows, but they're not doing it yet because King Robert is still alive. One big difference between the books and the show in this episode is that in the book, Sansa Stark inadvertently has a role in her own father's downfall. In fact, Sansa isn't in this episode at all, which is a shame. In the book, she warns Cersei because she's in love with Joffrey, and this accidentally betrays her own father, which is a real shame because Sansa and Cersei don't have many scenes together in the show. And also, it makes Ned seem like less of an idiot and more like he just got blindsided by one of his loved ones who was essentially manipulated by the Lannisters. However, one book difference that I did appreciate in this episode was the introduction of Tywin Lannister, which was pretty creative. He's skinning a deer and then touching his own son with the bloody hands of the skinned deer. All around, this is a great scene, great dialogue, a great performance from Charles Dance, and a lot of meaning for the characters here. Osha meets Theon, which is kind of unnecessary. Castle Black, meanwhile, is doing a lot of setting up plot, which made for some good scenes, but it lacks a lot of weight right now. The same kind of thing can be said for the brothel scene involving Littlefinger. Whilst it is a little bit heavy-handed, I actually quite enjoy this scene for the backstory and motivation it gives Littlefinger. For the first time in the show, we actually see his real self, and it foreshadows his betrayal of Ned later on the episode. So while, yeah, the sex position can be a little bit annoying, I did really like this scene. I also quite like Daenerys' scenes in this episode as well, in particular the failed assassination attempt, which was very tense, but because it failed, at least Bobby B can go to heaven knowing that Dany's okay. Rest in peace, Robert Baratheon, one of the more underrated characters in the show. And Drogo's speech later on is kind of excellent. But the main highlight of this episode is King's Landing, and I really like seeing Ned try to navigate this situation following his own moral code, whilst everyone else is following their own codes and are essentially trying to cheat the system. And this ultimately results in an excellent final showdown and a fantastic cliffhanger at the end of the episode with Littlefinger betraying Ned. So this did feel like it was setting up the chessboard for a lot of the bigger things that are going to happen in the final 3 episodes, but a lot of the content of it was still pretty damn good, in particular the King's Landing stuff. And because of that, I'm going to give this episode an 8 out of 10. It was pretty great. Then we move on to episode 8, The Pointy End. This episode gets off to a really fast start with the sack of the Starks in King's Landing, which, for starters, has a lot of shock value, a lot of violence, and some really heroic final stands, in particular Syrio Forel, who steals his final scene in a heroic final showdown, and somehow even Septa Morgadain gets a last stand as well. Arya kills a guy in a scene that's weirdly edited, however it is important for her character arc, and I actually think Sophie Turner does a great job in this episode. Her scenes with Cersei and Joffrey at the start and at the ends are very convincing. Ned and Varys' scene is straight out of the books, and Barristan the badass quitting is just an iconic scene. But the real focus of the episode is with Robb Stark, where Richard Madden really steps up along with his character. Seeing the Northern Lords come together and Robb take control of them is really exciting and a nice teaser for what happens later on, and you do have this real feeling of so much weight behind each character's actions now. We see Lysa refusing to help out, and it occurred to me when I was reviewing the previous few episodes that I never mentioned this, but Kate Dickie is great, and so is the child actor that plays Sweet Robin. The pair of them make for a really funny duo, very dysfunctional. They're extremely frustrating characters, but great characters nonetheless. And the arrest of Ned has massive ramifications on all of the other storylines, including Jon Snow's. Castle Black was pretty great this episode, and the Whites were creepy as hell. I also noticed one little thing, which is in the score there's a sound motif that they've used several times in Season 1, and it sounds eerily similar to the Light of the Seven track from later seasons. Daenerys, meanwhile, saves, in inverted commas, Mirri Maz Duur, and like with the last episode, it's sad seeing Daenerys make the same mistakes that you know are going to have bad consequences later on in the season, but at least we got an awesome fight scene with Drogo to accompany it. Tyrion also uses his wits to recruit the mountain tribes, and he has his first scene with Tywin, and these scenes are all very well directed, the dialogue is on point. I feel like I say this every episode in response to Tyrion. There are a lot of great moments, Hodor dick aside, spread across this episode, where it really felt like an ensemble piece. Characters are most really responding to the previous episode's antics, and more importantly, it's setting up the next episode's events. So where Ned and his big King's Landing storyline, for the most part, is taking the backseat, all of the other characters and plot lines are stepping up, which really made this feel like a huge fantasy epic. 9 out of 10. Season 1, Episode 9, titled Baelor, is fantastic from start to finish and is my favourite episode of this season. The cinematography is brilliant, the sound design is great, and the directing is excellent from Alan Taylor. Ned in the cells talking to Varys once more was a really nice scene, and it's a fantastic final scene for Sean Bean as Ned, who sold the character so well this season, and to see him go like this is really sad, but it's very true to the character. We see the twins in the titles, which is because, well, Rob is crossing the twins this episode. I love David Bradley as Walder Frey. He's able to play this tertiary character so disgustingly, and this isn't even his best or rather worst moment in the show. On the other side of the wall, we have Tyrion and Tywin, whose scenes together are always great, but the real gem of this storyline this episode was the Game of Confessions. We meet Shay, who gives us a really fresh take on Westeros. We learn about her, her past, about Bronn, but most importantly Tyrion. We hear the Tysha story, which is a very important one in the books, and to Tyrion's character, and it's excellently told here. Peter Dinklage is perfect for this role, and the parts that this bit of backstory plays in his character is clearly a big one psychologically. I sure hope this isn't the only time it's referenced in the show. The battle sequence looked great production-wise as well, whilst clearly limited by budget, but at least they found a funny way out of it. At the wall, Jon gets Longclaw. I was kind of mixed on the wall stuff this episode, but the Aemon scene where he reveals his backstory and gives Jon advice more than makes up for it. We have Robb defeating Jaime in a satisfying result, showing once more that brains beats brawn in this universe, and these tactics from Robb are actually pretty smart. We have Dany's story with Drogo dying from an infection, Jorah showing us why swords are better than arrows, and a glorious blood ritual with an excellent cliffhanger. I love Daenerys' part of this episode. It's able to get a good mix of cathartic moments, unsettling feelings, and I think sound contributes a lot to that. It's a great sequence with great performances and so many twists and turns. And finally, we have the big one. Now, very few shows have the guts to outright kill off their main character. Not this one though. This scene is perfect. I love the show-only edition of Ned saying Baelor to Euron. Joffrey is so hateable. The directing of all of the actors and extras is great at building the chaos. The editing, the camera work, they all make you feel borderline ill. And of course, there's a beautiful touch of them just having a moment of quiet as Ned accepts his fate. And I'm super glad that they didn't sell out and fully show the head coming off. Pun intended, this scene is perfectly executed and one that changed the show forever. 10 out of 10. And onto the season finale, episode 10, Fire and Blood. And I'm happy to say they stick the landing. Despite it being such a big story that kills off its main character, it's able to balance all of the other elements very well and conclude these storylines in very satisfying ways. For starters, the way they handle the fallout from Ned's death is excellent at the start, and the way they show grief from all of the characters is great, from Robb, from Jon, from Bran, Sansa and Arya is brilliant, but in particular I thought that Catelyn's grief was the most interestingly explored. I loved her scene with Jaime, which I think is a bit of a hidden gem in this episode. Great dialogue, great performances from both of them, and it hints at the arcs that both of the characters are going to go through in the future. At the wall, I like the scenes of the Watch helping out Jon, as it basically comes full circle from where he was earlier on, and I really like the end of them leaving to go beyond the wall. At King's Landing, Joffrey is so hateable. He's tearing out tongues, getting knights to slap his fiancée, and showing her the severed head of her father. And this scene is horrifying. The prop heads look excellent, Sophie Turner is brilliant, and the camera work surrounding this scene is so good. There's also the famous Pycelle scene, which is half funny, half unnecessary, but 100% weird, where he's telling his story to Roz. Meanwhile, Arya gets a haircut as she leaves King's Landing. Tyrion's scenes with the Lannister army are fantastic, and his chat with Tywin afterwards is great too. And of course, seeing Robb crowned King of the North is deeply satisfying. The music in this episode is superb, which kind of goes without saying, because it's always great. And it's also done very well in Daenerys' story arc. Her story has so many twists and turns this episode. The irony of her giving up her child to save Drogo. As a side note, the hair and makeup across this episode is really solid, and it's on full display in Daenerys' bits this episode. Mirri Maz Duur getting her revenge was a great plot twist that added a lot of nuance to Daenerys' story this season, and the scene of her killing Drogo was really touching. Her killing Mirri was a good payoff, and of course the final shot of Daenerys hatching the dragons is just iconic. This was essentially an hour of payoffs and setup for the next season, and it all works really well. The character moments all around were great. Technically wise, this is probably the best that the season had to offer, and maybe it wasn't as plot rich as the episode that preceded it, but the payoffs, the conclusions, and the raw emotion shown in the episode just made it fantastic. 10 out of 10, what a season of television. So there we have it, the first 10 episodes of what would be one of the best received shows of all time. However, does it fare by today's standards? Well, the answer is pretty well. Obviously, this show had some early budgetary restraints, but despite that, this show looks excellent. The sets, the location filming, the costumes, the props, the makeup, they all look phenomenal and bring Westeros to life in a way that feels very faithful to the books, whilst also still very believable and accessible to new viewers. Some awkward bits of exposition aside, this show is actually pretty accessible to new fans. But of course, it isn't the lore that made Game of Thrones so popular. It was the characters. This season did an incredible job developing and introducing its characters and bouncing them off of each other in exciting ways. There is not a single weak link in this cast. Everyone gives phenomenal performances, most have great story arcs this season, and they brought the characters from the page of the screen flawlessly, which is where I guess I could speak on adaptation moments. This is definitely the most book accurate season of the show that we got. However, what changes were made were actually really smart. Small scenes of characters who aren't POVs in the books are having scenes that weren't in the books interacting with each other and reacting to plot events. It's a clever way of killing time without adding extra story, but it still adds depth to the world, and the dialogue in these scenes is still fantastic. Pretty much every episode has several made up scenes of two characters that weren't point of views in the books, just talking, and those scenes for the most part are great. It was a great decision made by the showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, who I'll be referring to as D&D for the rest of this series. Pacing wise, there are some lulls, but that largely comes from trying to adapt a massive book. However, each episode on its own was pretty stellar, with an average episode rating of 8.9 out of 10. This series was said to be unadaptable, however, they did it, and despite the hate that the showrunners get, they absolutely deserve all the credit for this season. There were definitely some bumpy moments at the start, however the show really built its momentum and hit its stride with the finale, a stride that it would keep for many more episodes to come. This season is great, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to rewatch it. It's as good as I remember it, and it's still very faithful to the novel that it's based on. I'm giving this season a 9 out of 10. I'm glad to say that it still holds up very well. And well, that was a really long video. Thank you everyone for sticking through it. I have to say that I really enjoyed getting to talk about this series in such depth for almost 40 minutes at length, and hey, if you like this video, I'll do another one talking about Season 2 at some point in the future. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear what you guys think of this season and its episodes in the comments below. So, for the time being, thank you all for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. I've been Mr. Chicken Movies, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.